would like to talk about my teachers. I'd like just to take a few minutes and talk about some of the people that influenced me to play music. And I've studied with a lot of teachers. And when you study with a lot of teachers, sometimes it's hard to talk about all of them at one time when you're doing different things. So I thought I would make this video because I just feel it's important that my students especially know the influences that people had on me and how important it is. When you learn music from a teacher, and a lot of times you learn it one-on-one with a teacher, and that relationship it's a very important relationship, both from a personal growth standpoint and from a musical standpoint. And I was very fortunate to have many, many great teachers who all influenced me, and I wanted to just take a few minutes and talk about each of them. And I couldn't start without talking about Vincent Viscaglio. And you can go to my website, you can read about the story. He was my middle school band teacher. I played the bass clarinet in middle school band. And he knew I liked music, and he knew that was not the right instrument for me. So he somehow, he knew education, and he understood that I had a musical mind, but I was, first of all, a kinesthetic type of learner, a physical type of learner. And that I was a sequential type of person too. So the bass clarinet, for example, didn't make a lot of sense to me because the fingerings for a G and a G sharp were vastly different. And as a result, it's just a lot of things to memorize that didn't really have any connection, any kind of physical connection. Where, for example, on the electric bass, he bought me an electric bass and got me started playing bass. So you played G, and then it was G sharp. It made perfect sense to me, and I never played wrong notes. I figured it out. And it made him much happier than when I played the bass clarinet. But I always loved music, and I sort of toyed with the idea of being a musician. But once I got an electric bass in my hands, there was no question I was going to pursue music as a career. I just loved it. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity without Vincent Viscaglio. Very generous. He was my middle school music teacher. I did not have a high school music program. Going to a great high school that now has a music program, Xavier High School in Middletown, Connecticut, but didn't have one when I was there. So I studied private. I studied electric bass private with a man named Sal D'Alessandro, who was a very fine jazz guitarist and also taught bass at Rivers Music in Middletown, Connecticut. And he taught me many, many things. But the most important thing he taught me was music theory. And later on, when I went to apply to the Hart School of Music, at that time, I played electric bass, but I didn't play string bass, very much. I only had a string bass for a little while, a few months before I entered Hart. So they let me audition on electric bass, but they were interested, of course, in string bass. I don't know if they would have let me in Hart School of Music, except that I passed the theory test with a very strong score because I had learned that from Sal. So I thank him for that. When I was a senior in high school, I knew that to study music seriously, I had to buy a string bass. So I bought a string bass. And I tried to learn it myself a little bit, and it was hard. So I ended up going to turning to a player from the from the Hartford Symphony at that time. His name was Jim Carroll. And he was the first person to introduce me to classical music. I had never really played it before. And I took my first lesson with him in April of my senior year in high school. So just before I was applying, to try to get into, I had applied already and gotten into a couple schools, but before I applied to Hart School of Music, he's the one who encouraged me to stay in Hartford and apply to Hart. And he told me, introduced me to Gary Carr and some of the, didn't introduce me to him, but he told me he was there and some other great things that were happening at Hart. And one of the influences that made me think about going to Hart School of Music. And he encouraged me to do that. And also, he's one of the first persons who encouraged me to sit down and listen to classical music, which I hadn't done before. And I remember one night when I was a senior, sitting down and listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I had never just sat down and listened to an orchestra piece, and just being amazed at that sound and the musical concepts going, all the different things happening. And at that point, it was clear I wanted, that was aspect of music I really wanted to pursue. So I thank Jim Carroll for that. I went into Hart School of Music as electric bass and as a jazz major, which I still at that time didn't know really. It was, again, moving towards classical music, but I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. And I had a jazz bass teacher the first year. His name was Nat Reeves, and he taught me a lot about playing jazz upright bass. Nat was a great first call player in the Hartford, New York area, and great sense of sound, great sense of tone. Really taught me respect for the music, respect for what it meant to play bass in a jazz ensemble. How important the time was. He played every Thursday night at this club called the 880 Club, and several of us would go down and watch him. And he was in the house rhythm section, and he would bring in guests from all over the country would come in and play on Thursday night, and he would play and keep time for 3 hours and just make these groups sound great. So that was a great influence for me to hear at that time. And also, again, when I went to study classical bass as well. So Gary Carr was the bass teacher there, which just again, it was good fortune in my life because I think I would have ended up going to Hart School of Music anyway, no matter what. It was in my home state, and just happened to be this great, incredible musician there. And I didn't study with Gary privately my first year. I studied with his assistant, whose name is David Murray, who many people know now. He teaches at Butler University. Fantastic player. And he was a phenomenal player at that time. He was a master's student. Just great concept of sound, concept of time. His timing was and still is impeccable. I still get to hear David play once in a while. He plays in a quartet called the Bad Boys of Bass. And they come to Atlanta when the Astor Conference is in Atlanta. I've heard him play several times. And just phenomenal. So that was my first introduction to classical playing. And what David did is David encouraged me to play. I wanted to play recitals. I was a young player. A lot of teachers, I think, at that time would have said, listen, you're not playing long enough to play a recital. You shouldn't play a recital yet. But I wanted to do it, and he encouraged me and allowed me. And that made a big difference for me at that time. So I got to do a lot of stage playing, which doesn't seem to be a really important thing right away. But again, I didn't have a high school music program, so I had very little experience playing on stage with in classical music, and being able to play solo recitals made a big difference for me in my development as a player and as an understanding of what it takes to play music in a concert situation. Second year, I studied with Gary as a private student, and first year we did I went to his master classes and did his workshops and things. Gary was clearly my biggest influence. There's no question about that. And it's even hard to explain when you're around a musician of that caliber for a long time. It is you carry away so many things. It was almost 40 years ago when I entered Hart School of Music in 1982. So it's 38 years ago. And it's all 38 years I've continually dwelled on things that I've learned from him now, and things he said, but things he demonstrated, and the way he played. And it's a lifelong experience. It was I cannot say enough about what it was like to be in that atmosphere with this just incredible, gifted, and nice musician. When I first thought about applying to Hart School of Music, many of my friends said, listen, don't apply there because there's this very famous teacher there. You've not been playing long enough. He would not accept you as a student. And Gary's so generous. He would teach anybody, and if he knew you wanted to play and you were serious, he gave you time, and he helped you and gave you things to think about that would have lasted me a long time. So that was a great experience. And Gary ended up leaving Hart School of Music on my third year, and I studied for a semester with a man named Anthony Shelba, first call player around New York, former principal of New Jersey Symphony, very fine player. And he taught me, introduced me to some orchestral concepts that I had not pursued at that point, up until that point. He's one of the first people to teach me to play with recordings. I had never done that, play with, and he would do that in master class. We would sit around in a circle, like a bass section, and he would put on a recording of the Cleveland Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, and he was really precise about where he put the timing, where he entered notes and how clear it was. And I really didn't have a concept of doing that before, and I still remember doing that. And of course, I've played records a lot of times since then, and it's a common thing to do. And again, he was very patient with me because at that time I really was still trying to pursue the concept of playing that Gary had taught me, and I wasn't always receptive. So let's say put it that way, I wasn't always receptive to new ideas, and he was very patient with that. And the second semester that year, I started studying with Leo Antolo, who I'll talk about in a minute. But I still stayed in Anthony Shelba's orchestral class, and he was very generous. Sometimes when you leave a teacher for another teacher, they don't want to even know you anymore. And Anthony taught me, he stayed with me and taught me orchestral concepts. And basically anything I wanted to know, he was open to helping me. So I appreciated that. And then I studied my last semester and year with Leo Antolo, who was a great, great teacher and had a great knowledge of playing and had a real great ability, an impeccable ability to explain things. He had taught as Gary Carr's assistant for a while and had many influences on bass. And he understood all these concepts, from people he had studied with in the Chicago Symphony, from Gary, and he was receptive to all of them. He could teach all of them. He understood all of them, and again, was really patient with me. And he understood that I was a young player and just very, at that time, in hard school music, I was, when I graduated, I'd only been playing for about 4 years, so I didn't have a lot of experience, but I was very determined to do certain things. And a student like that is hard to deal with, because I was kind of strong-headed, even though I didn't really know, again, the famous quote, didn't know what I didn't know. And he gradually kind of took me along to introduce me to things he knew I needed to learn, but yet let me do enough of my own interests that made it, really a great time to study with him, those last 2 years. And this last year I was at Hart, Gary came in again as a teacher to do master classes. And so it was a really nice experience to take private lessons with Leo Tolo and then to play for Gary in master classes and watch him teaching in a group format, which I think Gary is especially good at. The other thing about Leland, which is really significant, is he's the first teacher I had who had children. At that time, when I was studying with him, I can't remember if they were still in the house at that time, but they were close. If they were in college, they were just newly going to college. So I met them and talked to him, and I watched him as a father. At that time, it didn't really dawn on me that he was kind of teaching me how to be a father, but he was, and those concepts lasted a long time for me. So when I ended up having a son in 1999, so it's, about 15 years after I met him. I had a role model, one of many role models, of course, my own father, of course, too, of, just what it was like to have a child. And so, again, when you study with people on a one-on-one basis, you learn more than just music. Music is a great part of it, but you learn a lot of other things, too. So I'm very thankful for Mr. Tolo. I always called him Mr. T, for showing me that. Then I went to Yale School of Music for my master's. And again, did 2 really intense years with Gary at Yale, and really pushed me musically. And I recall just certain things. When you study with Gary, again, he was very open-minded in many ways to all kinds of approaches to how you could hold the instrument, how you do certain things. Now, I always tried to hold the instrument like he did, but he had, we had students in the class who did many different things. But he pushed you musically. So whatever you were trying to do, he had you do it to the most musical level. If you just played a bunch of fast notes, he was not interested. You had to be able to show you knew how these notes related to each other and how they had direction and how to make a phrase. And one thing he used to teach us, which I thought was just uncanny, also had a great influence on me as a musician, because he would make us take songs, any song, and you had to play it, and you had to be able to make music with it. And sometimes he'd make us do an art song, like a Schubert song or something like that. But other times it could be any melody. I remember one time a student came and played this famous Beatles tune, Yesterday. And he was kind of playing it, and Gary was trying to explain to him, where he thought the phrase went. So Gary just kind of picks up his bass, his Juzak, student level bass, and played this melody on that bass like I've never heard it ever. So again, that kind of thing is just, it's hard to describe what that kind of experience, what kind of influence that has, on what kind of influence it's had on me. But I remember that to this day, and that was easily 30-something years ago. So that just demonstrates the intensity that he had. His assistant at Hart School of Music was Diana Gannett, who at that time, again, just really imaginative player, innovative player. She's going to have a great career. She received the ISB award, I think, a couple years ago. And, fantastic. And also has had many, many, many successful students of her own who I've gotten to hear and always have enjoyed their playing. One of them plays in the Bad Boys of Bass. She's one of them in the quartet. What really, really I remember about Diana, though, in addition to her great musicianship, was her commitment to her family. And she had just made some really courageous decisions at that time. She was a single mom in the 80s, which, as a 20-year-old kid, I didn't know what a single mom meant. I didn't know what that entailed. Now, having raised a child, and I only raised one. She had three. It's only imaginable. It's hard for me to imagine what that was like for her, to be trying to pursue a musical career and being a single mom at that time. And she had to make some tough choices, giving up some performance dates with some really, really well-known quartets that I know were hard for her and also affected her professionally. But she had the confidence that she was committed to raising those kids, and and she went on to have this great career. So I'm sure it affected her in some way, but obviously did not hinder her career. And that has always been a great memory to me, that you can be, if you're committed to what you believe in, and you work hard, there'll be a path for you, and you can be comfortable in what you believe in. And she's one of the first people I met who really demonstrated that in a very concrete way to me, and I've never forgotten it. So thank you, Diana. After my master's, I went on to get my doctorate at UNCG and the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And I picked UNCG because I met the bass teacher there, and I was looking around for different places to go. I wanted to find an orchestral-minded bass player who would be accepting to the types of things I had learned with Gary, and the types of solo playing and the style of solo playing that I like to do. And talking to Mr. Budrow on the phone, it was clear he was the one. So I went and UNCG, spent 3 great years with him. He furthered a lot of the orchestral concepts that I needed to work on. I had not really spent a lot of time on them. He had great articulation. His timing, his bow work was just fantastic. I remember he was so clear and so clean. He's taught me that you didn't have to be loud. You had to be on time. You had to be clean. And that's really has proven true, so many times over in my life, not just in bass playing, but in teaching orchestra. Teaching kids to play, you can teach them to play together. It makes a different, it makes a great difference, a great impact, as much as a great sound does. Both things are important, but that ability to play together and to play really on time and play cleanly, he had that, and it's just great to witness that. And also, he encouraged me to pursue my strengths in career. At that time, I was really beginning to focus more on my career, because when I was at UNCG, I met my wife, Jennifer, and we got married. So I was beginning to think more practically now than I did a few years earlier. And he just encouraged me to find where I'm strong and go pursue career choices that enhance my strengths. And I think that's ultimately how I ended up as a teacher. I just sit and just look and say, what do I do that works well? And I always was a very analytical person. And when I got the chance to start teaching actually in Vienna, and when I really enjoyed it. So at that point, it was I was going to be a music teacher then. And then when I got to Vienna, I went to Vienna on a Fulbright after UNCG when I was doing my doctorate, and wasn't even certain if I was going to study bass there when I first got there, because I knew my playing style was very different than what they did there, and I didn't know if I'd have enough time to really absorb what they were going to teach. And quite honestly, I was a little nervous to make big changes in my playing, especially at that point. I was getting old, in my late 20s at that point. But when you get a Fulbright, you have to study. So I applied to the school, and Jost Lindenhammer was Ludwig Streicher, who was well known in Vienna at that time, was still teaching, but he was teaching emeritus. So he was taking very few students. And Joseph was, the second teacher in the studio, and he had a large studio, probably, 30 or 40 students. And he accepted me and put me into his studio. I was very pleased. And he was a great, great player. And I think more than anything, great ensemble player. Ended up having a great career as a chamber musician. He also put out 3 very, very important solo records. His first record had several things like the Friva Suite, one of the first recordings of the Friva Suite. Valls, this Spanish composer who influenced by Battistini, recorded one of his pieces. His second recording was all Meshach. I think the first person to record all three Meshach sonatas in one recording. Really fantastic recording. I forget all the things on this third recording, but I know it was, I think the Nina Rota recording, concerto was on there. So other things that didn't get a lot of airplay. Didn't have a lot of, there were not a lot of recordings around at that time of these things. And he put those on record. But really, if you go and look up a group called Ensemble Wien, he's the bass player in that group. That's a group that has two violins, viola, and cello. They play in this old dance style of the 19th century in Vienna. He's the bass player on there, and it just made several incredible recordings. I still enjoy listening to them, and I still learn something when I listen to them every day. I have one memory of watching him play one time. They did the Soldier's Tale. This is called a group called the Wiener Virtuosen. And they played it without conductor. That was the first time I had ever heard it play without conductor. And of course, when you do the Soldier's Tale without conductor, it's the bass player who is the conductor. And there's this one part, there's one movement where you pluck, it's the waltz, and you're plucking, and you have to go boom, toom, toom, boom, you pluck one pizzicato, and you do two quick up bows. And it's a very hard thing to do, especially hard to do without conductor when you have to be so strong in the time. And he did it. I watched him do this, and he did it. Not only did he do it well, but he did it. It was like easy for him, and he was just like having fun doing this really hard thing. And I remember talking to him after. He saw he took the bow. He said, "I'll show you how he did that." And he just showed me how he held the bow, and it made a huge difference for me. And I ended up playing it myself about 2 or 3 years later, and I could do it because of what I learned from him. But it was just fun to watch him in a group with his sense of time, and just how much he added to the ensemble, and it really looked easy for him. So and again, also very patient with me, coming in with a different style of playing, and just introduced me to different concepts, the way they played in Vienna, and was patient in how I adapted things to how I gradually kind of changed my playing or added new things to my playing during that time. And I also studied with his assistant, Herbert Meyer, who's one of the principal bass players or solo bass players of the Vienna Philharmonic. And Herbert, I didn't take as many lessons with him, but just great articulation, a great player, and still plays with the Vienna Philharmonic. I just watched the other day the 2021 New Year's concert, which, of course, unfortunately, no audience, but the orchestra was there. The hall's all set up, and they played fantastic. If you have not watched that, please watch that. And he's one of the bass players there, just playing with as much energy as always. If you watch the 2013, if you can find it on there, he has a little solo in that concert, 2013 New Year's concert. But just great player, and I think one of the most genuine human beings I've ever met. Just very nice, very open-minded. Of all the people I met in Vienna, he was the most open-minded to the concepts I brought, having been a Gary Carr student. So, again, I could feel at home talking to him about certain things, and he took the time to listen to Gary's recordings. And I remember one time I was, it's just a funny thing. Gary has this kind of concept of using very little bow for certain articulations. I was telling that to him, and he goes, telling that to him, in German, I probably didn't say it very clearly. And he says, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I listened to Gary Carr. He sounds like he has a bow 5 miles long." And that's of course, Gary's sustained playing, So he, you listen to that, and this made sense to him, and he was able to articulate that to me. So that's not every music teacher I've had, but those are my main teachers who taught me bass, taught me on one-on-one. And there's a lot of them there. It's been my great fortune to be able to be around a lot of great musicians on a personal basis. So if you know any of these people, if you're watching this video and you happen to know any of these people, please tell them thank you for what they've contributed to, not only to my development, but to what they've contributed to music. And if you're one of my students, be thankful to them, because this is how I learned, and what I teach you is what I learned from them. So I hope if you stayed with this video all this time, you're very much appreciated. But I hope that these teachers get to see this, and I hope that they know how much I appreciate all that they've done for me. Thank you.